So welcome everyone to, this fantastic webinar we have prepared for you today. We have, really good, exciting host of panelists and hopefully a good discussion ahead of us. So this is the 2025 Trust Ledger webinar. And just to kick things off, I'm Darren Louie. I lead the product team for Proof. And today we have John Heisman, Pat Kinsell, and Will Charnley, joining us today to talk about this topic of fraud. I'm just going to let, each of you do an individual introduction. So John, why don't you go first?
Thanks, Darren. Hi, everyone. My name is John Heisman. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at Proof. I have over 20 years experience in InfoSec and fraud, and I've served as a CISO of a public company for 5 years prior to this role. And before that, I was the Deputy CISO at DocuSign. Real quick, my role at Proof is not only to protect our data and systems, I also head our fraud investigations and research team. This team connects the dots between fraud attempts we see day to day in our data and activity we see on the dark web around how fraud is actually perpetuated. Lastly, don't let the accent fool you. I'm actually based in Knoxville, Tennessee, where it's a beautiful 90 degrees today. Looking forward to the conversation.
Pat Kinsell, founder and CEO of this company. Been doing this about 10 years now. And what I would just say for folks on the call, we've said the entire history of the company that we serve life's most important moments. And for years, that was about digitizing them, increasing access. And for the last several years, that's been about securing those transactions. And we've really been on the front lines of this problem of stopping fraud so people can have certainty that their most important assets are safe and sound. And so I'm really excited about the webinar today and about the journey that we're on as a company. So thanks for joining today and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Darren. Thanks to the entire Proof team. Super excited to be on this webinar. Will Charnley, COO and Managing Director at Liminal. For those of you not familiar with Liminal, we're an actionable intelligence platform for regulated markets. One of those being fraud detection and prevention. A little bit later, I'll go through some statistics. And so what we really do, we look at the supply side of the market to understand what about 7,000 companies do in terms of the use cases they solve and their product capabilities. And then we also run about 500 buyer surveys every year to understand where the pain points are in the market. So as we talk about fraud, I'll be bringing a lot of those statistics in of where we're seeing that pain today. So super excited to be here.
Cool. And then just some housekeeping items. The webinar is being recorded and you all will be able to review that and get a link after the fact. There's also going to be a Q&A tab for you. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And at the end of the call, we'll try to get to a few of those Q&A. And then here's our safe harbor statement. You can read that. And then just to give you a sense of what we're going to cover today. So first, we're going to hear from Will and the Liminal team just to get an update on some of the research they've done in this area and talking about some of the industry trends. And then we're going to jump right into the discussion and use some of the topics from our fraud report to kind of have a discussion on some of these topics there. And then we'll have a discussion on what businesses can be doing, to combat this rapidly changing environment. And then we'll have some time for Q&A. So just a little bit of background, what we do at Proof. So as a reminder, our company initially started as Notarize, and we're known for really creating this category of remote online notarizations. When you think about what like an online notarization is, it represents, some of the most critical things you're going to sign for or authorize. These things need a strong form of identity verification. It's getting you to sign or getting your signature on a form in the presence of a notary who can witness and acknowledge that you've signed. And then at the end, they sign and seal this document. So if later there's a dispute, you have this proof that it was really you that authorized this thing. So it's no wonder that, for a lot of really important things you do in life, things that have a high dollar value requires a notarization. So for example, in real estate, we've done millions of closings. And today we estimate that's about $487 billion worth in property that was closed on our platform. And when we kind of estimate our volume, in Texas, we could say, 1 in 10 homes will be closing on our platform, digitally. When you think about withdrawing money from retirement, you often have to sign these forms, for regulatory requirements. So these ERISA forms that need to be signed in front of a notary. In financial services, we estimate that we're securing about $150 billion in total money outflows when people sign for these forms and withdraw money from their 401k. And The way we're doing that is through our platform that can really be used to secure any type of authorization. So whether that authorization needs a form that needs to be signed with a notary, we have the notarized solution. And sometimes you just need a secure digital signature, and we have a solution called Sign. And sometimes an authorization doesn't need you to sign any form of paperwork or any form. And so you just need to do an identity verification or confirmation. And that's why we have our Identify solution. And there are certain cases where you do want the person to meet with an agent, but there's no document you need to sign, but you want to meet them face to face, do an identity verification, and have that all recorded. So that's our verified meeting. And all of this runs on a platform with fraud detection built in. So Defend is this real-time fraud analytics platform that is monitoring all of our transactions and trying to detect and flag suspicious activity to see if someone's trying to forge your signature or impersonate your identity. And we're able to connect the identity as they come through the platform. So if one business marks a particular signature or identity as fraud, right, then the rest of the businesses or consumers on our platform benefit. So if the fraudster tries to go to a different bank or to a title company down the street who's also on our platform, they will also benefit, from us having to seen this fraudster before and us flagging that person as suspicious. So you can really see that we've expanded our mission beyond notarization. And this is why the topic of fraud, is so important to us. And so that leads us to this, the trust ledger. We produced this 24-page report. It's really born out of many conversations we've had with our customers who are really telling us that fraud is really top of mind for them right now. And what can we do to learn more? So we compiled, a pretty comprehensive overview using a combination of, strategies, market research. We even use some of our own data and what we've been seeing on our platform. We've surveyed, customers and industry experts to get their thoughts. And then, John's team has also been doing a lot of research into the dark web and monitoring what fraudsters are really doing and saying in these channels like Telegram to bring back to you some of the insights of what, fraudsters are doing on the front line. So we're pretty sure you're going to enjoy reading this and using it as a great resource. But before that we go there, I want to, turn it over to Will, who's going to share some, industry research and what's going on with the rest of the world.
One of the big areas that we're covering here at Liminal is around deepfakes and also the synthetic identity. We just concluded a bunch of research on fraud. And the bad news for many folks here is it's increasing pretty dramatically. I won't read the stats on this page to you, but just some things to call out. When we went out and talked to practitioners, folks who are actually trying to solve against deepfakes, what we found is people are really ill prepared for what's happening out there. 87% of the buyers we talked to in our most recent study had no actual processes documented or any tools identified to detect deepfakes in real time. And deepfakes and synthetic identities were comprising about 60% of all identity fraud attempts in their onboarding environments. So this issue is rising, it's increasing, it's getting worse and worse, and most businesses are not prepared enough. On the supply side of the market, unfortunately, we've seen a similar issue wherein it's about 18% of the 7,000 companies we actively track actually have dedicated tools as part of their product to detect deepfakes proactively, not retroactively. So as we continue with this webinar, I think one of the key things you're going to continue to hear from me is, fraud is increasing. Technologies are emerging. It's getting easier than ever. And this is causing major issues that need addressing. As we get to the next slide here, cool. There it is. Buyers are ill prepared to deal with the fraud. So two main factors. You can see there's two colors on this page. Your turquoise or teal. When we went out and talked to buyers, these are the pain points folks are feeling from fraud volumes increasing. So a big issue now is not just that fraud's getting better, it's that the volume is going way up. I know we're going to talk about some of the drivers of that, a lot of the fraud as a service platforms that exist out there. And then your blue bar chart here is going to be fraud is getting actually more sophisticated than ever. So one of the big issues that not alone can be attributed to AI, but is being driven a lot by AI. For those of you who saw what Sam Altman said yesterday, is AI is making fraud easier than ever, but also better than ever, right? Things like phishing, where you used to get an SMS that was fragmented or broken or didn't sound like a business. You can use tools to make that sound just like a Bank of America teller, and you could not just one Bank of America teller. You can make it sound like thousands of Bank of America tellers within seconds. On the volume piece, one thing we found as part of our research, account opening fraud this past year increased by 34% compared to last year, which is a huge, huge increase. And the losses we projected at $4.6 billion just for synthetic identity and deepfakes alone in 2024. Given where people are expecting things to go this year, we think that number is probably going to be above 6 billion for 2025. On the sophistication front, when we went and talked to buyers, 70% of the fraud teams we talked to said they have now observed some form of organized attack patterns. So we're talking about, professional fraudsters that are attacking their platforms. AI generated documents were also one of the number one cited things that people pointed to as rising. We talked to one bank and they told us the top 2 or 3% of the documents in terms of quality and clarity that they see are all fraud. So one of the ways that they actually weed out fraud is if the document looks too good, it's fraud, because people are not good at actually capturing those documents. Sophistication and volume, a lot of it is due to better technology. I know we'll chat about this a little bit more, but overall, we're seeing things like device and IP diversity tools to bypass traditional methods of fingerprinting. We're now starting to see behavioral spoofing. So where you used to be able to say, hey, there are no mouse movements as part of this flow. This is definitely a bot or a fraudster. We are now starting to see that. And synthetic identity use is happening more than ever. Last slide here. Kind of adding to this problem, and I apologize for being the doom and gloom of this webinar, is it's not, we have historically seen a lot of fraud and fraud attempts happening in financial services. That is not the case anymore. Industries like healthcare, payroll, telco, marketplaces, payments, e-commerce, these are all big targets now. And as you can see, this color coding, the issues can be unique depending on those industries. So some of the use cases that we're also monitoring outside of account opening, one big area I'll call out, ACH fraud. We saw that rise about 31% over this past year. Also adding a lot of nuance into fraud through things like, as you see here, number 2 most cited pain point, social engineering or scams. We've also seen a number of attacks in B2B fraud. This increased 24% this past year. With the ability to create fake entities with forged EINs to charge folks. We've also seen a lot of rise in employee fraud, fake workers, workplace kind of mules. That has been on the rise as well this past year. So it's not just one place we're starting to see this. It's across many different use cases, many different industries. So if you're sitting here and you're saying, hey, that hasn't really come to us yet, it's really time to start acting now before things get really grim here. With
Cool.
that, yeah, Darren, I'll pass it back to you.
No, that's great. That's a perfect segue into actually our first topic for discussion. So, the report really tried to paint this picture that the issue is no longer, reserved for folks that are working in financial services. It's really starting to hit a lot of different industries. 60% of respondents that we surveyed said they're extremely concerned about this problem. 70% said they've, seen a significant increase or a spike in the number of cases of fraud or scams that are hitting their business. So maybe the first, thing that we can, serve as a discussion is, Pat, you talk to a lot of industry leaders all the time. What are some of the stories you're hearing from different industries to kind of paint a picture of what's happening in the world?
Yeah, first and foremost, I would just say that I think people are really frustrated. And it's, in COVID, people made such an investment in going digital. And almost immediately on the heels, we've got this new landscape of impersonation and deep fakes and fraud. And people, A, can't go back because they've changed customer expectations, they've changed systems, but they're also now having a return of fraud into paper channels. And so, I think people are really having to rethink everything about the way that they do business. We're hearing from a lot of people that they're looking at all of their tools again, talking to all of their vendors about who has solutions. And so it's almost like a back to basics, way to approach it. And some of the examples on the screen here around utility companies. I mean, the stories are crazy. I mean, these are people that are impersonating homeowners to submit basically for rebates that are costing utility companies an obscene amount of money. I had a meeting just this week with a large professional sports team that everybody knows, talking about their program around season ticket holders and scalpers and pretending to be members of their community. I think people have heard the HR examples. I mean, these are going through the roof. And frankly, it's something in our own business that we have seen, people applying for jobs who are actually, from North Korea or from Russia, and maybe they're trying to, get access to systems, or they're trying to, basically get a couple months of payroll, property managers on the screen. It's rampant. And I think, what's concerning on both fronts is it is overseas, actors that are doing this at scale, but it's also family members. These tools are so readily available. It might be a daughter trying to, impersonate her mother and withdraw funds from retirement, or, take a HELOC out on a home. And so it's really a pervasive problem right now, and it's a back to basics reimagining of trust and of certainty in all of the transactions that we do.
Will, when you talk about stories and, fraud types of attacks that you're tracking in the industry, what are some of the like really interesting stories than the non-traditional, non-account opening types of typical fraud that you're seeing? Like what are some of these examples you're seeing in the industry?
Yeah, I think outside of some of the industries you have here, I'll highlight a few others. One is, m many different words for this vertical, but gig economy or some of your B2B type or P2P type marketplaces. We are seeing a lot of muling that's happening. It's a huge issue, right? Where someone might onboard who is an acceptable or good user. That account is not held with that user beyond that initial onboarding. And then whether it's a driver, whether it's someone doing delivery, whether it's someone potentially cleaning your house or caring for your children, it's someone that has not actually been vetted by that profile, which is a huge, not only fraud issue, but really safety issue in many instances. And another one I'll call out is healthcare. We have seen a ton of fraud increase in healthcare, obviously, with adoption for things like telehealth and online prescriptions being a big one, right? That's an area that is digitized really quickly and not necessarily built the same tools in place that you have in financial services. And we hear a ton about loss there. For one, I won't name them, but one healthcare provider in particular, they were, they thought they didn't actually have any way to measure it or know that they were losing millions, if not tens of millions of dollars each year to fraud. And they had no way to tell. They couldn't actually run analytics on it. They didn't know how to detect the fraudulent profiles. So a huge major issue in these industries and in many others for sure.
And then John, you're monitoring the dark web and seeing what the fraudsters are seeing. What are the industries they're starting to go after now? We're not just seeing people talk about like opening up credit cards and opening up bank accounts. Where are they attacking?
Well, frankly, Darren, no industry is off limits. Anywhere there's money to be made from abusing a business process for gain, you will find discussion of it on the dark web. And in general, regarding some of the trends we're seeing, you won't be surprised to know that what we're seeing matches exactly what Will described earlier. We're seeing increased services for carrying out fraud. I know we're going to talk about fraud as a service in a little bit, but I'm reminded of the phrase "a rising tide lifts all boats," which was popularized by John F. Kennedy. Now, normally this phrase is used to refer to positive economic uplift from an initiative, but I recently saw it applied to nefarious services on the dark web, which I think is a really great fit for it. So fraud as a service raises the capabilities of all fraud actors. In other words, it makes fraud more accessible to more bad actors. And likewise, we're seeing an increase in detailed fraud tutorials and discussions that target specific processes at specific institutions. And to make matters worse, some of these tutorials are even available on the clear web, the internet that we all know and love. You don't have to go onto the dark web to find some of this information, which of course increases the reach of who can obtain this information and then act on it.
Well, that's actually a good lead into the next topic, right? Which is how AI is really fueling and weaponizing, fraudsters, and enabling to really do more damage at bigger scale and getting more coordinated. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what are the types of strategies that fraudsters are sharing and the tools that are now being enabled by AI, and that's being talked about in these Telegram channels.
Yeah, well, I think we're at the confluence of a few important factors. Firstly, the kind of building blocks of fraud is really personal information, and you can see the stat here: 2.8 billion passwords were leaked or sold online. So there's an astonishing amount of information available from info stealer malware and breach data sets. On the dark web, this is typically known as full details consisting of first name, last name, physical address, social security number. And we're seeing a race to the bottom regarding the cost of acquiring fulls. It's typically around $2 to $3 to buy an individual's personal details, but I've seen that go as low as 20 cents to get somebody's social security number, for example. So that's kind of the building block. And then the second part is just really the personal data to kind of round out a profile beyond just name and address and social security number is so readily available. Think of social media, all of that information you can gather. Think of other clear web sites, the people finder sites and property deed sites, all public information you can use to enrich a profile. And then lastly, this is where sort of AI comes in and adds fuel to the fire, that the capability to spoof via Gen AI aspects of the transaction process, such as how an individual presents themselves via video or audio or the presentation of ID documents. So it's really the confluence of all of these factors that put us at this sort of unique point in history where fraud is this problem we must address now.
So in the report, we talk about this, right? We talk about, these tools are now becoming available. We called it fraud as a service. You think about it's almost like a SaaS service, right? You could pay Fraud GPT a subscription, and fraudsters basically get a malicious version of Chat GPT that they could use to conduct fraud. And especially with this, rise in how we're thinking about using AI agents to do things on our behalf, this is going to be a big problem. And so, Pat, what are your thoughts on, how are we going to solve this agent problem? What if AI can do things on our behalf now? What's that going to do to this problem?
Yeah, maybe I'll kind of split it into two different sort of responses. So first off, I think just building on, what John said, just, to give people a really concrete example of how these AI services are being used for nefarious means. Right now it's a huge problem of deed fraud or seller side fraud in real estate. And so people are using the methods that John described. They're crawling county databases. They're finding someone who owns their home free and clear. They find their name, they find their address, they find them on social media. They build a deep fake likeness of them. They build a fake employment history, financial history, and then they go and steal, your home out from underneath you. And what's interesting in that process, because it's a free and clear home, there's no mortgage lender that needs to be notified. The homeowner doesn't need to be notified. And the county recorder doesn't, in many geographies or municipalities have any responsibility or even authorization to assess what they're being presented. They just have to file it. And so you own your home, everything's great, you've paid it off, and all of a sudden you find out 2 years later that someone actually sold it out from underneath you. So first and foremost, I think that we have to have a discussion around, public records data and the role of people in these really critical processes where, I believe that home ownership, for example, is really the center of wealth creation in this country and of property rights and your stake in society. And it's a really critical, important thing. So is your retirement. You work your entire life to accrue these funds. So one, I think there's a debate that needs to happen around all these, topics. But two, the only way to solve these problems is to actually have an established relationship with who that consumer is, right? And really to have a persistent identity where no matter where you're transacting, people know that this is Darren, right? And trust builds in that profile over time. And so it's linked to your bank, it's linked to, other services that you use. And the fact that that identity over time isn't associated with fraud really can help people believe and assess that this really is Darren. And so long as you can maintain that relationship, you can maintain trust in the fact that you're really interacting with Darren. And I think these agents are really no different. I mean, it's interesting to me, this world that we're all going to have bots running around doing stuff for us. No one's really asking the question, well, what happens if something goes wrong? And in our business for 10 years, what we do a lot of are things like powers of attorney. And so, this is you're signing up for, wealth management or for medical services, and you give someone permission to make decisions or to act on your behalf, to trade stocks, to, whatever it may be. There's a legal framework around this, and you have certainty that the person actually authorized that decision or that process. And I think that's really critical as we move forward too, that again, that this is Darren, that Darren has authorized this agent to go book a trip or trade stocks or do something on your behalf. And when someone is interacting with that bot or that agent, they can have certainty that they has permission to act on your behalf. And so, really tying it all together, again, I think these systems that are public, perhaps shouldn't be or should perhaps have different safeguards around them. I think we have to move to a world of persistent identity that can be trusted over time across parties. And I think we have to have an authorization framework for these agents that have certainty that Darren really did approve, this AI to go off and do something on your behalf.
Will, what are your thoughts about AI agents and how does the industry think about that problem?
I think Pat's 100% right. I think we're also going to see a lot more issues with agents if you're not authorizing them around things like first party fraud. Because, I didn't make the bet that the Patriots would win the Super Bowl this year. My agent did, and it went rogue. And so there's a lot of gaps, I think, in the market today and in scenarios that people are not thinking about, that are going to become major issues because, as John said, fraudsters are very opportunistic. And if you shut down one avenue for them, they just rush into another avenue. It's like a hole in a boat. If you plug one hole, another one opens up and still going to flood your boat. I think on the other side, where we talk about fraud as a service here, it's easier than ever to make pretty sophisticated fraud. I mean, you don't have to go to the dark web to get tools together that will do voice emulation. And as long as you give it a few prompts, you can have it do pretty much anyone. Same for deep fakes. There are sites out there where you can get a fully synthetic identity that looks 100% legit for $1. Makes it incredibly affordable and scalable to commit fraud. And there are also now ready-made kits. So you need no actual programming ability to do phishing, to do credit card fraud, to do money laundering, to do mule services. They literally give you the toolkit and the instructions. It's like a developer kit for fraud. So I do think, like, some of the traditional ways, and Pat mentioned this, that we've done improved identity in the past has been stagnant and one time. And then we're relying on, hey, we did it. It's all, or maybe it's time-based. You can't do that anymore. Identity really has to be tied to nearly everything you're doing, especially if there's monetary value there as well.
There's a analogy I like to use when it comes to fraud as a service, and that is it's like renovating a house. There are some parts of the project that you may want to take on yourself, like painting perhaps. And to do this, you need some materials, you need the paint and the paint rollers, and you need some knowledge. So maybe a tutorial on how to paint your house properly. There are other parts of renovating a house that you may not feel comfortable doing, so you might want to outsource to contractors, things like electrical and plumbing work. So in the fraud space, doing the painting yourself is the equivalent of a fraud actor going and buying those full details themselves, reading tutorials on how to commit the fraud, then carrying it out themselves. But hiring the contractors, that's the equivalent of the fraud actor using services to create synthetic identity documents, for example, or even using services to do a complete KYC, know your customer bypass using false perhaps that you gave them. So the takeaway is that the dark web is this, right now it's this fragmented ecosystem of sellers. And they offer three things. They offer data, like the fools we've discussed. They offer knowledge, how to configure open source deepfake tooling to do a face swap, for example, in real-time video. And they offer services as well, like creation of those fake documents or full bypass of the KYC. And this ecosystem is only going to continue to evolve with AI.
It almost feels like it's like an industry burgeoning, right? So like Will, you could have a honeycomb landscape for like these are the people that are generating fake ID documents. These are the people that have a lot of data. These are the people that give you compromised passwords and solutions. It's pretty quite insane.
I always say I'm on the wrong team. There's a lot more money on the other side of this coin than there is on the side stopping the fraud today. It's easier than ever to make money being a fraudster in today's world. 5 years ago, you needed to have some technical aptitude. You don't need that anymore. Anyone can do it, and anyone can do a pretty decent job with it. Yeah.
So on this topic, we started touching on this concept of like, okay, maybe I verified your ID when you open your account, but how do I really know it's still you when you call the help desk or you go to do something later, with a bank or with an organization? This problem of synthetic IDs and deepfakes is becoming a huge problem, right? Like I think a year ago there was like funny videos on Instagram and people would be like, haha. And then every single month it gets better and better and better to the point where almost anything you see now on LinkedIn or Instagram, the first comment, everyone is like, is this even real? Is that AI? So like deepfakes have come a long way in a very short period of time. So Will, what are some of the solutions you're seeing? I know there's like deepfake detection solutions out there, but
Yeah.
is that really going to be the silver bullet?
Yeah, to the point you're making, I always think of the Luka Doncic trade for any NBA fans out there. When it was
Yeah.
first reported by Woj, everyone thought his account had been hacked. They didn't know that you can't trust anything. Um, yeah, I think you mentioned deepfake detection. That is definitely a strong capability. It's a rare capability that we've actually found. I think I mentioned this before, but it's 18% of the companies we track out of 7,000 actually have that capability. It's not it's not a silver bullet though. You really need to have a layered approach to do this. First, Pat mentioned the idea of persistence. It is key to have visibility across your own life cycle of who that person is. And I see Angela's question, I'm sure we'll get to as well. You talk about how do you start understanding like this is a legit identity, the legit person, and then be able to do that throughout the life cycle. That's incredibly important. We found as part of our study that it was 56% of onboarding fraud cases actually passed a basic KYC check. I think, John, to the point you were also making. So if you're even just doing that up front, you're letting a lot of bad actors into your system, which is why you really need to do that on a persistent basis. Another thing I think that's really important is to be able to take a networked approach. You can see things across your own life cycle, but actually fraud detection is way more powerful if you can see it throughout an ecosystem of other providers. So if I can, as Bank of America, also understand who that actor might be at Wells Fargo, you can more proactively catch someone within your network if they start acting poorly somewhere else. Right now, that kind of networked approach, I think, is pretty rare. When we talked to folks, it was 14% of the banks, financial institutions was a study that were actually implementing that. But I think that is really key, right? Fraudsters, as John mentioned, are sharing a lot of intelligence. Fraud defenders also need to be able to share intelligence. And then lastly, I'd say, being able to combine not just deterministic data, things like, SSN, which I think we've all talked about is pretty accessible, but also probabilistic signals into your solution as well. So things like behavior, things like device IP. Again, none of those are silver bullets, but combining those two things are way more powerful than relying on one alone. Yeah.
So, Pat, Will talks about this network approach. Where have you seen some industries really do that well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the best example is the payments industry. And I think for folks who followed us for a while, I'm probably a little bit of a broken record. But I think that this notion of a general purpose shared credential is extremely powerful. And if you think about the way the payments industry work, you have a credit card, you're issued it, and you're not very trusted at the outset. You don't have much credit. And over time, as you use that card, your trust grows. And I think about our platform, I think what's important for people to understand is that, we sit in a lot of high value transactions. Someone is selling their home, they're withdrawing, a large dollar value from their retirement account or 401k or whatever it may be. And over time, as we process these transactions, it's actually an extremely interesting signal if fraud is then not reported, right? If someone suddenly has $150,000 taken out of their retirement account and they've used this identity to do it, and that person doesn't wake up a week later and say, "Oh my God, my money's missing." We build trust in these people over the course of time. And what's so interesting about the payments industry is that, to give people an example, just last year, Stripe partnered with Capital One to share data. These are two enormous companies with access to, many, many hundreds of billions, if not even larger volumes of transactions. And they still felt they didn't have enough data. In many of the industries that we serve, there are efforts to build consortiums, to build, you know, uh, fraud sharing groups. For example, the retirement industry has Spark, right? And I think Will, in the examples that he's giving, he's talking about banks, the 14% that may be a part of some fraud sharing consortium. These are extremely sophisticated organizations and people that probably have, they're in the payments industry. So they understand how this has worked in that part of their business. And they have teams that are already, fighting this battle together and sharing data. Like if you go into equipment leasing, if you go into retirement, commercial lending, small business lending, I could go on and on. These people don't have the same resources, the same sophistication, the same trade groups, the same, legal organizations that figure out how to share, fraud data. And so we've been very focused on, an out of the box platform that people can deploy into these use cases that allows them to have these trusted persistent identities that bring in data from other industries and use cases. And then, lastly, I would just say that one of the great things for people out there is that all of us, the identity industry, is really starting to figure out how to partner together. And we're really all trying to move beyond this idea of, I think, check the box compliance identity verification to real fraud detection, fraud mitigation. And, I would highlight, for example, we have a great partnership with Socure. We have a great partnership with Reality Defender in the deepfake space. And to Will's point, what we at Proof are really trying to do is bring this technology into all these use cases to give people that persistent view of their customer as they onboard someone, as they close transactions with someone, approve wires, account changes, whatever it may be. And so, we are figuring out as a group and as an industry to better serve these. these challenges. And so, I would just really, encourage people that if you're not in your own industry talking about how you can benefit each other, you need to start doing it. I mean, in the title industry, for example, there are people who just go from title company to title company to title company and commit fraud, right? And so it's pretty obvious that they could figure out a way to work together to solve that problem. And if you are having this conversation as an industry and with your peers, I would really encourage you to start to look outside your group and to ask yourselves, what other industries can we get a richer and relevant view of those same consumers to inform, our view of those customers? Because I really believe a network-based approach of persistent identities is the only way that we're going to solve these problems.
All right, so we're going to end this section with, a few stories. I think 2025 is just going to get nuttier and nuttier. I think the entire industry, like, always talks about that executive in Hong Kong that got swindled with a deep fake for 25 million bucks. But now, like, every single day, there's like another thing, right? Like, there's a report of someone calling into state leaders pretending to be Mark Rubio. There's, you know, people got turned upside down with like this Jerome Powell resignation letter. Everyone thought it was real, and then it was like, oh, that's fake. Sam Altman now saying you can't trust voice biometrics. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see, what happens because this is starting to tick up at a very rapid pace. So let's talk about what can we do about it, right? So fraud prevention strategies, and you as a business, what can you do right now? So maybe John, kick it over to you. As a CISO for our company, how should CISOs and information security, leaders at different companies be thinking about this to protect themselves or protect their business?
Think there's a lot of parallels between cybersecurity and fraud, except that fraud is awareness is lagging behind cybersecurity, perhaps as much as 10 to 15 years behind. To take a leaf out of the cybersecurity playbook, we need to think about visibility. If you don't have visibility into business processes or the right kind of visibility, then we can't effectively defend the organization. That goes for both cybersecurity, and we've made big strides as an industry of getting that visibility into systems. And it goes for fraud as well. I think earlier on the anecdote, I think it was about a healthcare company that was unable to measure losses due to fraud. Like if you don't know this is even a problem or which of your business processes are susceptible and what the risk is, then how can you effectively begin to defend against it? So I think companies really need to think about this problem from the top down. There needs to be very clear roles and responsibilities. Is it the CISO's purview? Is it somebody else in the organization? If no one thinks it's theirs, then nothing's getting done. Who owns this problem in the organization? And then what are the business processes that could be susceptible? And like cybersecurity, it's really kind of cross-functional here in a large organization. There'll be a lot of departments with a lot of business processes that are susceptible. And then, how do you get some data around this? What are the what are the losses? What are the most risky processes? And only then, I think, can you really start to think about what technology, some of the things we've discussed, how can you leverage that technology to help solve the problem?
And then maybe last question for Pat, right? As we kind of round out this topic and this discussion, you know, we're we're meeting with a lot of companies and organizations that are dealing with this problem for the first time. They've not, when you think about if you work in financial services, surely there's a fraud team. There's a bunch of people that have been working on this problem, but you're not in some of these industries that have had this problem in the past. It's like completely new operations that you have to be thinking about. And so how does an organization that's not been, traditionally had to deal with this problem responding to this type of thing, today?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo, John's point that there's a lot of similarities to to cybersecurity. I think the real question is you've got to figure out who in your organization has an adjacent, expertise, right? So if you are in the payments business and you have a fraud team, if you are in, some other category and you have a strong cyber team, and I think, one of the things I heard at an industry conference recently is there's AI is forcing, IT and infosec, cybersecurity and fraud to collaborate. Things like authentication, right? You may think that someone's coming through and they're doing SSO, and so I'm covered, and that's wholly insufficient, right? If you don't include that team in the conversation, you're out of luck. And the other thing I would say that I very strongly agree with John on is visibility. If you do not have visibility into these transactions, you are hosed. And frankly, almost everyone we talk to right now either knowingly or suspects that they're underreporting the amount of fraud that they actually have. Everyone believes it's even worse, the numbers that they have, because they lack that visibility. And so, we often start, as an example, with our products, just giving people a pilot of our fraud monitoring service, because it's a big wake-up call. And then we can start to have conversations about what to do and how to change business process. I would also say that there's a lot of other added benefits. Like, we work with a lot of our customers to move identity verification earlier in a business process. People often wait till the last minute in order to try to make sure that someone is who they say they are. But if you think about it, you've already incurred all of the cost in your business of perhaps underwriting a loan to a fraudster. If you can weed those people out earlier on, there's a lot of ways that you can save costs, provide better customer experience to legitimate people. And the dream here, or the vision here, is that legitimate people should be able to get through faster, better, right? And you don't want to lose sight of customer experience. And so, I don't know, I think people have got to get started on this right away. It's a really critical problem, and we're certainly happy to help.
So that, with 10 minutes left, I think we will go into our Q&A section and look at some of the questions folks have submitted. I think this is an interesting one. We talk about the network approach a lot. So can you expand a little bit more about what does it mean to, take this network approach to fraud and identity a little bit more? So maybe Pat, Will, you want to elaborate on that and maybe even talk about how that's different than consortium, which is a different term that we use in the industry.
I'll try to do it in kind of the most simplified terms, but networked approach can be done a number of ways. You could do, I mean, there are consortiums out there, but the benefits of a network approach. So ideally, right, if you are verifying Will Charnley and his identity initially the first time, and let's say I'm onboarding at Bank of America, I'm just gonna use the same examples I've been using. And I'm a good user. You understand the benefit, acting and behaving normally within your system. I'm also onboarding with Wells Fargo and using that same vendor to do that process. Right? They can also flag and add additional trust that, hey, this is not only a good user because name, DOB, driver's license, selfie, liveness, all that stuff matches, but we've actually been seeing this user and understand him at another network, another associated company. And the benefit of that, to Pat's point, there's a UX benefit to that. There's also a fraud prevention benefit to that, wherein, let's say in Bank of America, I continue to act normal and okay, but in Wells Fargo, all of a sudden I am initiating a bunch of $9,999 transactions. I'm clearly engaging in some type of muling behavior. If you're Bank of America, you can then stop or pause that account, flag that account before I actually act badly at a different institution. And you can do that across banks. You can do that across other types of organizations, right? Lending, payments, banks, healthcare, et cetera, to better flag that user, even if you're not detecting fraud within your system, if that person is acting in a certain way in another system. Second thing, if you start to see patterns of behavior, so not just Will Charnley's behavior, but hey, all of a sudden we are noticing that these types of behaviors at Wells Fargo are indicative of fraud coming down the pipeline later, then you can also start to flag those behaviors and patterns, not just about Will Charnley, but about mass groups of users.
Yeah, only thing I would add on top of that, just as an example, just to help crystallize it in people's minds, is again your credit card, right? And if you think about it, you have your credit card, you go from merchant to merchant to merchant, and if you go into Nordstrom's and buy something, and they flag it as fraud, your credit card gets revoked, right? And so it protects the network. Now, the people downstream don't get any personal information about you. They're not told what you did or your data underlying your account. It's just when you go to transact, you can't, right? And then you have to reestablish trust. You have to contact the bank or the issuer of your credit card and reestablish trust, and you get turned back on the network. And without turning this into a really technical conversation, Proof has built that same underlying system for identity across our platform. They're the certificates that people use to sign content. And so when someone is in our system and they're signing transactions across a platform, you can imagine, I saw the poll, there's many people from the real estate industry. You can imagine you sign the purchase and sale agreement at the beginning of a transaction. You then connect with the mortgage lender and the title company. If anyone in that system starts to suspect suspicious behavior, they can report it and it can be revoked. The person can't continue to transact. The network is protected. And so, we think that's the solution. And that model's been proven to be tremendously successful in credit cards, trillions and trillions of dollars of transactions. And we believe the same is true for identity.
And then we talk about this layered approach, to fraud prevention, that sort of thing. Do we want to elaborate a little bit more on that, John? What does it mean to have a layered approach to security and fraud prevention?
Well, I think as we've already outlined, I mean, you got to sort of take things one step at a time. You need clear ownership in the organization, you need visibility, and then you can start to think about sort of technology and processes. What are the business flows that need to be protected? The company will have lots of them potentially, and some are going to be more at risk than others. So getting data, as we ascertained, is hugely important there. So you can prioritize which ones need to be protected, and then just sort of thinking about like going through that flow, as we've talked about, where and when are you doing identity verification, for example? Is it at the end of the flow? Or are you putting it at the start? So kind of deconstructing that, and in cybersecurity terms, we'd call it threat modeling, essentially trying to understand, think about the flows from an adversarial perspective. Okay, if I was a fraudster, what could I do here? With the knowledge that you'll find in our report, for example, and information on sort of deep fake. If you think, okay, if the person came in and they had all of the information that we typically ask, profile information about that person, if they had that right to hand and they looked and sounded the same, like how would this play out? What are the protections? So really kind of modeling it from this adversarial perspective.
And then one final question, and I think we talk about doing ID verification upstream, maybe 30 days later going to a closing meeting or having to verify that person's ID again. How do you know it's the same person? Like, how do you actually solve that problem? Maybe Pat, do you want to take that?
I can, but Darren, should we put you in the hot spot for the last question? Because I know you know this one.
Well, we talked a lot about this concept of a reusable identity. So the first, being able to establish this person's ID and giving them a digital identity, digital credential protected by a biometric. So later on, we can rely on the fact that we did positively ID that person, used a secure form of authentication. And nowadays, this seems like SMS and OTP and MFA is no longer enough, but biometrics still remains as one of the most secure ways to authenticate back into a saved identity. So having some way to do a very quick and accurate biometric verification gets you back into that identity. So you don't have to answer KBA questions again. You don't have to scan a picture of your ID, and you can just join a meeting and go straight to the closing. All right, we have 5 more minutes. It's going to wrap up with hot takes and final thoughts. So maybe we'll start with you. Any final thoughts or final remarks you want to leave the audience with?
Yeah, you mentioned KBA, so maybe I'll kick us off from there, which is we recently did a study on authentication, and it left me more sad than I've been in a long time, where two of the most used methods were KBA and SMS OTP, which are the least secure methods to do any type of verification, to authenticate an account. And I think it was around 46% of the people we talked to didn't actually have fraud protocols in place. Their fraud protocols were KBA, SMS OTP, what I would call like authentication methods more than anything. If you're sitting in this audience and you're saying that sounds like me, I think hopefully this is a good call of we need to really understand someone's identity, and we need to do a job of understanding how to prevent fraud throughout that customer life cycle to make sure that that user is good when they sign up, when they re-access their account, when they change information on their account, when they transact or want to borrow money, all those things. So if that's you, these guys at Proof can definitely help help put you in the right direction.
John, any final thoughts?
Just want to build on something Will said there about sort of KBA and threat actors sort of building out profiles to be able to answer that kind of information. One of the sort of secondary steps that a threat actor will take after they've acquired fulls, those full details, is an enrichment stage where they really build out that profile. And I mentioned social media earlier, but I also mentioned there's services on the dark web, fraud as a service. And one of the services you can use is a lookup service. And essentially, the lookup service abuses legitimate tools, often for law enforcement purposes, investigation purposes, financial institution purposes, uses these legitimate services that have access to vast quantities of data on individuals in the United States and beyond to basically fetch all of that information for you. So you don't really need to do too much work as a fraud actor to go build this profile in order to bypass something like KBA. It's a simple lookup service, and those are available for about $15.
So you're saying KBA, I don't even need to get your fulls. I will just log into these KBA systems that were designed for law enforcement or admins and be able
Or
to
rather, you might start from a list of fulls and sort of narrow it down to your target individuals. For example, as Pat mentioned earlier, people that are free and clear of their mortgage. So you've got your set of now your potential targets, but you still need some more information to bypass something like KBA. So then you would pay nefarious actors on the dark web to do this enrichment for you, and you get the full information back that would enable you to bypass KBA.
That's wild. All right, Pat, any final thoughts?
My final thought is that these problems can be devastating. I know some title agents that have, personally lost millions of dollars. Um, you know, just horrible stories of seller side fraud, impersonation, deepfake, whatever it may be. And I think the reality is that who is stuck holding the bag on these issues is not well understood, and it's probably you, or it's your consumer. And there are people who are losing their retirement. They're having their home stolen out from underneath them, buying a home that was in fact not legitimately owned by somebody. These are devastating, devastating problems. I really, really hope for everyone that they never experience them in their own life. But they're incredibly challenging to deal with. So I really encourage people to take it seriously and to try to get ahead of it, and that you never have to go through it.
Cool. All right. And with that, we're going to wrap. I want to thank Will, Pat, John. Thank you so much for your time today. But thank you everyone for your time. Thank you for dialing in, spending an hour and talking about this really, really important product, really, really important problem, for the industry. So thank you.